Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we are going to be talking about grieving voices and journeys of loss, and we have some interesting journeys because you and I have had a sibling loss, I've had a child loss, we're going to have loss of a parent, or we're going to have loss of a spouse. So we're going to talk about what's kind of similar about the journeys and how people get through grief and loss and how important it is for all of you out there listening to us today. But before we start the show, I wanted to remind people that my new book that I've written with my fiance, Dr. Frank Powers, after the loss of my husband, I was going to write a book for widows, and I went online because I decided I needed a chapter on online dating, Heidi.
Yep, and you met your fiance.
That's where I met my fiance, another therapist, and I said to Frank after we were together, why don't we write the book together, because I have learned so much about a widow, and he's a divorcee, and he's learned so much about the whole journey together, and we've told stories about our clients, and also our journey, our own journey with our families. So we hope you'll get this book. It's on Amazon. We want to remind you that 100% of the proceeds are going where, Hyde?
To Open to Hope.
Right, with a mission of helping people find hope after loss. So we'll hope you get it there on Amazon. And leave us a review. Thank you. All right, Hyde, do you want to introduce our topic again and our guests?
Our topic is Grieving Voices, Journeys of Loss, and we're going to talk with two people today that have taken this journey of loss and gone on to find hope again. I'll start with Meghan Riordan-Jarvis on the end here. She has 2 master's degrees, and she is also a licensed clinical social worker. She is an author, podcast host. Her podcast is called Grief is My Side Hustle. She has been a TEDx speaker twice, and she has created the Grief Mentor Method to help everyone create a structured, personalized grief process. She has also written 2 books, Mom. Her memoir, which is right here, and it's called End of the Hour.
End of the Hour.
And she's got a new book that's going to be out in October of 2024, so we're going to have her on today, again, when that comes out. And that is called Can Anyone Tell Me Why? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss.
All right, Meghan, welcome.
Welcome, Meghan.
Thanks for having me.
And next to Meghan is Abby Dart. Abby holds a law degree from Loyola Law School and is a member of the California Bar. She worked in the political arena to build awareness about our mental health system and is still building awareness. In 2004, her husband, Steve, a Harvard and Oxford educated lawyer who seemed to have it all, died by suicide. Abby talks publicly about this in the hope that it will help others. Welcome, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Abby. You know, I was thinking about the fact that you're a lawyer. Now, all of the rest of us here are therapists. And you came into the grief and loss world through a whole different spectrum.
Right.
You came in through the law and looking at it a little differently, and then had somebody die by suicide.
Right. So even though I'm a member of the bar, I only practiced very briefly, so my career was in politics. But you're exactly right, because when my husband died, it was very clear to me that there was some negligence. And so I looked at it through the eyes of a lawyer. I mean, I didn't handle the case, but I did reach out to attorneys. And what I learned, I mean, sort of interesting. This was 20 years ago, but I learned that from many attorneys who wouldn't touch the case. They said nobody understands suicide. No jury gets it. They think that it's just something that someone does to themselves. Like, oh, I don't want to live anymore, I'm going to do it. They don't see it as any negligence on the part of somebody else. Like, they're going to do it no matter what. So, now this was 20 years ago. We now know that mental health intervention, medication, therapy, we know all those things can work to prevent someone from dying by suicide. But back then, and I don't know what it's like now, but I mean, I pursued it, but with that understanding that nothing was going to be easy.
You know, it's interesting. Some of the research we have now shows that if people can stop from doing a sudden impulsive act, like jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, is why they put the nets in under there, because they found that it does prevent suicide.
Right. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that negligence. Well, Megan, I wondered, did you feel like there was negligence with your mother? I know that she did go into the hospital and they released her, and you, I guess she was having some stomach issues?
You know, I didn't really hold anybody in the medical community accountable. I think probably whatever it was that ultimately she died of was something that had been slowly really making her ill for a long time. So it didn't, I know some people do sort of run to that and feel that the doctors didn't support them well. When my dad was dying of cancer, there was a lot of back and forth inside hospitals, a lot of different doctors that he was still seeing. And I constantly felt angry and frustrated that people were not saying that he was at the end of his life, that he was dying. He ended up in a rehab facility where people were supposed to be getting well, but where he was recuperating from a surgery. And those were really the first people who were sort of, you know, talking about calling hospice, end of life. And I just, it was very late in the game for some of my family members to be hearing that for the first time. So I understood that small cell cancer was a diagnosis of really the end of his life. And I have a friend who's a therapist and used to be an oncologist. And anytime my family would be talking about like, well, you know, he's looking better and it's all, you know, maybe he'll be feeling better by Easter. I would feel so crazy that I would end up calling my friend and being like, hey, and he'd say, nope, still dying. Like,
so that
just
was the reality.
grounding
Yeah,
me in the reality of like,
Did you say things to your dad that, knowing that he was dying, were you able to say things, or did you like say goodbye or talk about unfinished business or have conversations around it?
I really took my dad's lead as he was at the end of his life. So some of it was he didn't have a ton of stamina. You know, the cancer had really ravaged his body. My dad was a brilliant man who spoke multiple languages and, you know, wanted to talk about Gore Vidal, whether you wanted to talk about Gore
I
Vidal
read
or
his
not.
obituary. He was unbelievable.
My
My
father
mother and I
was-
read it out loud. He was outstanding.
Yeah,
He
he
was.
was quite a
My
rock
dad was
star.
really an extraordinary man.
Yeah.
And so mostly what we did was talked about times that we had spent together, and I let him retell stories about sort of his glory days that he had
that's
told me
nice.
before. And some of them I recorded so that I would have his voice telling those stories that I'd heard hundreds of times.
I love that.
But he did, you know, my dad had a really large community, an international community.
What
and
was his profession?
He worked as the, I guess, sort of like CEO of a trade association here in New York that built and developed shopping malls.
Wow.
And he came from, you know, real poverty in Belleville, New Jersey. So
Fascinating.
his ability to work in that position was really extraordinary.
I know with cancer, I know that you had talked before. I'd heard you say that knowing he was going to die, you took little sips.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that people often ask me about as a trauma therapist is like, is this grief worse or that grief worse? You know, I think because they're trying to find a way of validating how dysregulated and difficult the experience is. I do think when you know someone is dying, the way I describe it is you can participate in that process. You can look away if you want. Either way, the moment of their death is going to be hard and difficult and often surprising and super painful. But I had the opportunity to fly back and forth and see my dad. And part of what was happening there is my brain was learning that he was dying because his weight dropped and he looked less well. And then he was not able to talk as much. So the way that I describe that is I was consciously taking sips of grief.
So you're preparing yourself physically, psychologically, and emotionally for the death, slowly.
As
right?
much as you can.
Yeah.
The way that I often think about it more is like I was learning, right? So, you know, there's cramming for an exam where you're trying to get all the information in 24 hours before the test. And then there's the starting 6 months before and slowly trying to integrate the information. I was more going to see my dad. You know, we spent a couple of weekends where I imported all of his contacts from his iPhone into my iPhone, and I went through every single contact.
So you actually knew for sure that it was going to die.
Yeah,
Whereas
absolutely.
with Heidi's dad, And my husband, he had a staph infection after back surgery, so they kept trying to save him and get his white count up. So, and you weren't able to come and see him because of COVID.
Right.
Oh, COVID, yeah, that's
Yeah,
horrible.
I would
So
fly
brutal.
from New York
Really.
to California, but I couldn't go into the hospital,
Yeah.
even though I had already had COVID, because I got COVID very, very early. And they were like, it doesn't matter, you know, you still can't go
Yeah.
in. And I'm like, but I want to see my father. I want to see him because I was worried,
Yeah.
you know, that something was going to happen. And it did.
Yeah, and it was a tough situation. Interesting, I was at the hospital and I wanted to get him out of that hospital, and they never talked about the fact that he was going to die.
Yeah.
And I sat down with these two doctors, and they were like, when I told them I was going to take him out, and the reason I took him out of the hospital was because I wanted to put him in a hospital where I had a private doctor.
Sure.
And I was moving him to another
Did you
hospital
move
because
him?
I was not happy about
because
the
it
care.
was during COVID.
Yeah.
Right.
And
And I wanted to get him out of that hospital,
course.
so we had to do some pretty circuitous things to get him out. I won't talk about that here. But they sat down and talked to me about taking him home because they felt that I realized he was going to die, and how wonderful it was that I would sit and talk to them about him dying like this and all that, and how many years have you been married and all this. And they were like patting me, and I was taking him out
That was
because
not what
I
you were
did
doing.
not like
Yeah.
that
You were trying to
hospital.
save his life.
I was trying to save his life,
Yeah.
and they were acting like I had given up.
Yeah.
So that was pretty interesting. But so I don't know. It's a weird experiences. The different journeys we've had over loss, and
And you, I'm guessing, Abby, were completely shocked when your husband died by suicide, or
I mean, yes, although my expectation when I dropped him off at the hospital, we went together, was that they said, we are going to get him better. He's in good hands. You know, so my expectation was, you know, relief. When you've been dealing with somebody who is in the throes of serious mental health issues, it's constant. You know, you talk about my health. I mean, it's a constant tightrope, and you're just on edge. And you finally feel secure.
Yeah.
You're in a hospital.
Yes.
Right? I mean, they're going to get better.
yeah,
So
he's being
yes,
taken care of.
absolutely
Yeah.
huge shock. And yeah, and I had somebody or an institution to take my anger out on. I mean, I guess it was kind of helpful in a way. But not helpful because it was a 4-year process. So I had to keep reliving, you know, what happened for all those
because
years.
you were bringing it up in court.
Yeah, through the process.
Yeah, I've found, and I don't know about as a therapist, that people, particularly because I've lost a child, so I get involved with the Compassionate Friends, and
Right.
I get involved with a lot of grief and loss with people who've lost children, and it really is hard for them when there's a murder or a suicide or some kind of neglect when they're in court.
Yeah.
It is really difficult.
Oh, really hard. And
really difficult.
My family has a bunch of lawyers, you know, in it. I mean, my on one side of my family, and they told me, and his best friend is a lawyer, and Steve was also a lawyer. So, and he said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because it's going to prolong or complicate an already complicated grief." And given what I know about the political system and the legal system, I said, absolutely, because I don't want them to do this to
Someone
another
else.
family.
I was thinking that for you, there's a lot of meaning in it, because if you can, you know, stop this from happening, then
Right.
somebody else is not
Right.
might live and
Right.
not be released too early
Absolutely.
and discharged earlier than they need to be.
Absolutely.
You
I
probably
mean-
I'm sure you've saved lives.
I hope so.
Yes, yeah. You had a reason, and a lot of people do it to give them meaning. You know, we've had Candy Lightner on a number of times,
Yeah,
and
and I worked
Candy
with
started
Candy.
Mothers
Yeah.
Against Drunk Driving. And one of the things she has told us is, when we ask her, "What do you suggest to people?" She said, "Grieve now."
Yeah.
Grieve now. She said, "You know, I didn't grieve for 4 years." Because I was busy in Washington, D.C. lobbying. But she did make a sacrifice doing that of her own grief for the greater cause.
Right.
But it does prolong. You can't delay grief. Grief is going to come and get you.
And you know,
You can delay it, but it's going to come and get you.
Yeah.
And this is a little tidbit, which is it's kind of weird, but I want to share it. When I was just out of law school, my sister had a friend, maybe a friend of a friend, who was a young wife and mother from a just a lovely family, and they had 5 children. And she told me, "Oh my gosh, the husband just died, leaving her alone with these 5 children." And I'll never forget. I said, "Oh, that has to be the worst thing in the world. Have 5 children and have your husband die suddenly." That's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
20 years later.
Wow.
And I remembered that feeling, like, oh, that poor woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Wow.
Well, you don't think it's going to happen to you.
you never
Right.
think. You never think
never-
it's going
you
to
always
happen.
think
Until it
somebody
happens to you,
else.
and then you always think it's going to happen
Well,
to you. I mean, that's
true,
the
Megan.
legacy of
It's-
loss.
Isn't it true?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
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 Well, I wanted to say when my son was killed, Heidi's brother, in an automobile accident or an automobile crash, whatever, his cousin was driving the car. And I thought it was interesting because the lawyers came to us. His the people that the kid had insurance with came to us for a settlement. We didn't even ask for it. They came to us and said, whenever there is an accident like this or a driving incident, there is a settlement.
Wow.
And what you have to do as a parent is pretty disturbing. You have to go in, and the lawyers decide how much your child's life is worth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And they haggle over it. Right.
That happened after 9/11 too.
Yeah.
The families I worked with, we had to sit down and every single person that died, we had to go
Right. And the lawyers are
put
taking
a
a
dollar
percentage.
amount on how
Right.
much their life was worth.
Yeah, and the lawyers are taking a percentage.
So that is heinous because he was only 17. His life was worth this and this and this.
Yeah.
And we ended up, this was 40 years ago, we ended up with $100,000. My husband did not want to take it.
Yeah.
He said, I think it's blood money. And they're like, the lawyers are like, this is the way it is.
Right.
Every accident has a settlement.
Yeah.
And this is what's done. So we ended up taking it and starting Open to Hope and doing things, which a lot of people do, you know, charitable things with the money and, you know, try to.
So I'm curious to shift gears for a minute. Now that you're all, even my mom, further down the road, if you had to give your own self advice early on in your grief process, what would it be? Now that you know what you know now.
Great question.
Yeah.
You know, I think what I would say, which is something I now say to a lot of people, is that you become a griever similar to the way that you become a parent. Like, you're going to be a griever for the rest of your life. It's not always going to be active. It's not always going to be super painful, but it's what you become. And I think if you think about it that way, what do you need in order to go through this transition into who you are going to become? Because the pain of the reality is that you can't go back. There's no going back after your loss.
Yeah.
And it's not just you can't go back in time, it's that you can't go back to that person that you were. And I think if you think about that, it becomes more like a developmental process. And maybe you can invite more resources in and more connection and more curiosity and also more failure. You know, we want to feel better when we're grieving, but we don't always get to feel better. The pain is the thing that drives a lot of that traumatic growth. It's the thing that drives us to do things like start foundations. But we can't circumnavigate it. You have to let it unfold. And so I think about it almost like adolescence, which is like, it is super awkward that you have, you know, that your legs are growing so long so fast and that your teeth and your, you know, all the ways in which you're developing. We know this isn't what it's going to be like to be in your body forever, but we can't get there any faster. And I think if I were to go back and say to myself, it's not about recovery. It's not about necessarily even healing. It's about becoming. You are about to become
like
something that you haven't ever been before.
I like that because that's not, you don't come from a loss. Like, I want my past life back.
Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah.
like you said, it's a very strength-based way of looking at it.
Well, it's
You're
hopeful,
becoming
right? I mean, I
something
think
else.
what we need in grief, because it feels so impossible, people are so stunned by how bad it is. They have no idea how bad it is.
Yeah.
I think what we need is that idea that, like, it is not always going to feel this way, and that this horrific moment is not definitely going to be the first bad thing that happens and the end of all good things that have ever
Yes,
happened.
that's key.
Right?
Because sometimes initially you think the best part of my life is just ended forever.
Yeah.
All the joy is gone. It's over. And that's not true.
No, but you have to hear that from people who are 10 years down the road,
Yes.
and you have to lean on their belief, as you say here.
Yeah.
But you also are going to feel that for as long as you're going to feel it. When a widow, an early widow, says to me, "I am never going to get remarried. I am never going to date again," I say, "I absolutely believe you."
Right. Because right now she's in that space.
I just say, "I believe you.
Yep.
I understand what you were telling me. I
Yeah.
absolutely believe you." The same way that when my 16-year-old daughter says, "I am never speaking to that friend again. I am never going to have another friend again. And my whole life I'm going to be alone." I say, "I know, kiddo. That is exactly what this feels like right now."
I love it when you're saying that, because what it is I think people feel like they have to talk and have solutions, and all you have to do is listen.
And argue with people's reality.
Yeah.
What do you think, Abby?
Yeah, I think I have a different perspective, but I think it's because of the suicide aspect. It's kind of like a homicide and a violent act, and kind of with me every day. Good things have happened. My children have gone on to graduate, and I have a grandchild, and I'm really happy about that. But, you know, with all those good things, I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer, but it's like, oh, but Steve's not here.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
so, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. I mean, he's not here, and that's
Right.
sad, and that's depressing. But I'm trying to get the joy, you know, of having the grandchild, of seeing my children excel. I mean,
Right.
you know, I didn't remarry, but I was engaged twice, and neither would have been good. So, but I would say to women, I hear you, and nobody will ever take the place of your husband. And don't feel guilty if you want a date, if you want that
Right.
hug, or whatever you end up doing, because, you know, I get it. I mean, I
Right.
get it. That's what
Right.
you're used to.
Right.
Well, and you're making a good point. You're saying, look, it's bittersweet. I miss him, and he's not here, but I also have joy, but I still miss him. I mean, we can hold two things together.
That's right.
These two things can
That's right.
exist, right?
They have to.
And the other thing I want to say is to people with grief, and you have your own grief, like, I feel sometimes that I was so preoccupied with my own grief that I didn't think about my children's grief. I mean, I tried to help them. Or what about Steve has 3 sisters? You know, what about the loss of their brother? His mother was alive, the loss of her son. So, I mean, don't take on too much, but I think it's good to be aware that, you know, you're not alone. Everybody has their own grief, but there's people around you that are also grieving, and maybe you could lean on each other.
Well, and I have to
Dead.
say, as the child, because you all had children.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't have a child when my brother died. I did when my dad died, but we see you and hear you and know you're struggling, even if it's in your bedroom. So I think that, you know, you're not out in Hawaii on the beach by yourself getting a suntan. So I think that we actually give you a lot of slack, even though we might not tell you.
Yeah.
Like, I knew my parents were down, like they were brought down to their knees. They were like, I'd never seen them so vulnerable. I was like, okay, you know what? They're not the parents that they were, but they're doing the best that they can, because I can tell that they're not in a good place. So
Yeah, I had a death in my childhood when I was 9, a teenager that was beloved to my family, drown, and my mother really was impacted. She watched his body taken out of the water. My brother found him, and she experienced PTSD. I know that now. I didn't understand that as a child. But a lot of what I tried to do as a kid was sort of like help out. And I know now as a clinician that I developed a kind of codependent relationship with her, that I was trying to help her so that her mental health would be more intact. The true thing that drove me to decide to check myself into an inpatient facility, and I write about this in my book, is that I was on the floor in my basement, basically immobile, in so much pain because my back had gone out. And the doorbell rang, and I heard my daughter, who was then 12, her best friend came over and said, "Do you want to come out and play?" It was right before school started. And I heard my daughter say, I think I should probably stay here in case my mom needs me.
Wow.
And that I was like, nope, nope,
Yeah.
nope. We're not doing this.
So what you haven't heard yet is Meghan actually put herself into a mental health facility for 19 days.
28 days.
28
Yeah,
days.
28 days.
And took care of herself. You know, I want to say before we close this show that I want you to all know that the worst thing that ever happened to you is what's happened to you. You cannot deeply know another person's loss until you've had that loss, because comparing losses is not useful. And when you hear us all talk about our journeys and stories, for some people, the worst thing that can happen is a hangnail, because that's the only thing that's ever happened. Because I remember as a therapist, after my son died, people would come in and tell me these stories, and I'm like, blah, blah. And then I had to realize one day, they can't know the loss that you've had unless they've had it and what it means to you.
Exactly.
And we want to all say here, I think that God bless you all with your losses, right?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody experiences loss and grief differently, and there is no medicine. There's no right way. I always tell people, it takes how long to put your feet back on the ground as it takes.
Right.
Right? I mean, there's no
To get
prescribed.
you back and moving.
There's
and
no prescribed,
doing.
time.
And no loss is worse than next
No.
for you.
Comparing losses
It's your
is never
life.
helpful. Right, because I don't know what it's like to lose a child, but I know what it's like to lose a father and a brother. Those are my losses, and they were horrific for me.
Well, also, I ended up checking myself into an inpatient facility because I was so impacted by my mother's death. But the other lens of that was my mother was 75 years old. She died in her bed holding her rosary
Right.
with her family around her, having visited most of her family
Yeah.
recently. So there's another version of that story that I describe as one of the most traumatic events of my life, as the most beautiful death that
But
ever
it
happened.
was the most traumatic
Yes.
death of your
Yes.
life. Your husband died by suicide was the most traumatic.
That's right.
Or whatever. or
100%
whatever
the most, and it has affected me and made me the person I am, good or
Right.
bad.
right.
But let's all say post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
Yes.
What has it done for you in a quick couple of words? One word, because we've got 21
In a
seconds.
post-traumatic growth way.
Yeah, in a post-traumatic growth way, it has allowed me to continue to live.
All right. How
And
about
it's
you?
fully enabled my resilience to shine.
I would second that. Yes.
Yep.
It
Resilience.
puts everything in context.
Absolutely.
We've climbed Mount Everest. Okay.
Yep.
We can do it.
We can do it. You can do it out there too. And thanks everybody for joining us on the show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own. And God bless.